Hi, and welcome to another lecture video for History 1302. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 17, Freedom's Boundaries at Home and Abroad, 1890 to 1900. I did make my slideshow based on the fourth edition, so excuse me if they've changed the title of the chapter. Today we're going to be, like I said, we're going to be looking at this chapter, so we're going to go ahead and jump right into that right now. Okay, so this chapter is looking at essentially. I'm going to kind of back up. This chapter is essentially looking at a few major topics. This is continuing our discussion of the Gilded Age. We began in chapter 16, and is so we're looking at the labor side of things a little bit, the political side of things a little bit. We'll be looking into the racial aspect because a lot of time when high school students, right, learn about U.S. history in high school, the way it's segmented, it depends on the school. It also depends on the state a lot of the time. But generally speaking, the Gilded Age is taught over here, and then segregation, Jim Crow, the African American Civil Rights Movement is taught over here, whatever, right? And as if they're separate. But the Jim Crow segregation and all that stuff that goes along with that is very much a part of what makes the Gilded Age, right? It's part of what, the Gilded Age we talk about is kind of like thinking about the late 1800s from kind of a mostly kind of negative point of view to some extent. And one of those aspects is very much the disenfranchisement and oppression of African Americans in the American South. So they go hand in hand. So it talks about that for a bit. It talks about immigration restrictions. And then the last chunk of the chapter is actually about American imperialism or expansionism, as it's more often called. And that too, same thing. That is usually taught as its own unit in high school, but it really is part of the Gilded Age. Part of the Gilded Age is that our government began to expand beyond our borders and in mostly very disastrous ways for the people we came across. So anyway, that's what this chapter is about. Is those things. So we're going to get started. The first item on the study guide that I wanted to look at is the introductory story to the chapter. Actually, is about the Homestead Strike. So when we learn about Andrew Carnegie in chapter 16, and especially if you've done your Voices of Freedom assignment that is due this week about Andrew Carnegie, you may get the impression that, oh, well, that Carnegie fella, he's pretty good, right? I mean, Gospel of Wealth, he says, that the wealthy have a obligation to use their wealth to help the poor, right? So sounds like a pretty good guy. I think what we'll find in history is that people are good, people are bad, people are both more often than not. And you don't get to be the richest man on the planet Earth without being very bad sometimes, or all the time, most of the time, perhaps. And so, the Homestead Strike is a particularly brutal story of a strike and it being broken at Carnegie's steel works at the town of Homestead, Pennsylvania. So the steelworks, the workers at the steelworks were organized by, represented by a national union called the Amalgamated Association. Amalgamated, they represented people that worked in trades dealing with amalgamated metals, amalgams like steel, bronze, things like that. Mostly steel, though. And anyway, they, not a huge union by modern standards, but pretty big for back then. They represented like nearly 4,000 employees across the country, mostly in Pennsylvania, because that's mostly where the steel industry was, thus the Pittsburgh Steelers football team name, right? And anyway, so they had a lot of control at Homestead. They had a contract with the company that gave them the right to approve the hiring of new workers. They could, they had to sign off on the machinery being sped up, things like that, because of the safety issues. Carnegie and his business partner, Henry Clay Frick, they felt like the union had too much control, so they decided to run the union out of the company. Now, Today, that would be very much illegal for a company to do. But those laws didn't exist yet. They exist because of things like what happened here. And so basically, on a Sunday, they brought in construction workers to build a big fence around the factory. And then when the workers showed up on Monday, anyone who was a member of a union was banned from entering. And so that was how they basically just fired any members of the union. So the union workers, with the support of people in the local community, set up a blockade around the company, preventing scabs, that is non-union employees, from getting in. And so and to be clear, Carnegie was out of the country at this time. He was vacationing at his castle that he bought in Scotland. Because, like he said in Gospel of Wealth, the wealthy should use their wealth to help the poor. And I guess he wanted to, I don't know, employ some scullions or something, but some castle maintainers. It's a joke. Anyway, and so he knew what was happening, though, and he told Frick, yeah, take care of this. So Frick took care of it by hiring mercenaries. There is a mercenary corporation, similar to, say, Blackwater today, though Blackwater has a different name now because they got in trouble for committing war crimes in Iraq. But anyway, but similar idea. It was called the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Now, they call themselves the Pinkerton Detective Agency. You may have run across the Pinkertons if you played Rockstar's Western game Red Dead Redemption 2. They're villains in that. The Pinkertons you may have come across in history as well if you are interested in things like Jesse James, who was captured by the Pinkertons. But while the Pinkertons call themselves the detective agency, and they do have private detectives, the main thing the Pinkertons do is act as corporate mercenaries, sending essentially mercenary armies to provide security and muscle for companies like Homestead, like Carnegie Steel. And so they sent 300 mercenaries, Pinkertons, and they fought the workers. 7 workers and Pinkertons were killed. I'm not sure how many of which. The Pinkertons ended up retreating. So the governor of Pennsylvania sent in 8,000 state militia, the National Guard, essentially, to open up the complex and make sure that the striking workers were not able to prevent the company from operating without them. And so the amalgamated association was destroyed. And that's it. What do we get from the Homestead strike? It is just the perfect, typical example of how things are going to go for organized labor in the Gilded Age. Company X will treat workers poorly. Workers, either unorganized or organized by a union, will try to stop them through mostly peaceful manner. Mercenaries and or police and or the military will be brought in to crush the union to the benefit of the big corporation, with the government actively helping the corporations do these things. And that's basically how everything's going to go for organized labor for several decades, really until the 1930s. It's not going to be till the 1930s we're going to start to see things turn around. And that's because we're going to have a pro-labor president in the White House. And yeah, so anyway, but for now, things are bad for organized labor. And this is a good example of it. However, something else we see in this is that the community of Homestead overwhelmingly condemned what the company was doing and supported the workers. So we also are seeing that. Just spill water on my face somehow. All right. Anyway, moving on. So the next item they talked about here was problems for farmers. And I'm not going to go too much into this because, to be totally honest, I find it a little boring. But it is something that, we do normally like to talk about because it does have bearing on American politics and labor and all that going forward. And that is the plight of farmers. Farmers were in kind of a bad situation. I mean, small farmers, obviously. Big agricorps have always been fine, right? But your average, independent farmer was having a hard time, right? Because he's competing against these big agri-corporations like Del Monte and Tyson. And he's heavily dependent on railroads for transporting his goods, but the railroads charge unfair prices. They charge the little guys way more money per ounce or pound or whatever than they do the big companies. And he's very dependent on banks for financing because he's always in debt. And the banks, again, are going to give much more favorable interest rates to their competitors than to the little guys. And they're also kind of at the mercy of public utilities for water, right? That's a big thing. Access to water, big deal. And so these problems are facing farmers. And there's also an added issue, and that is, the whims of the market, right? This year, corn's, $1 a bushel. Next year, it's 80 cents a bushel. Del Monte can afford a 20% drop in the price of corn. Mom and pop on their family farm cannot, right? And so these are problems for the farmers, and they end up forming a political party called the Populists. To be fair, their actual name was the People's Party, just everyone called them the Populists. And this party actually was fairly successful in electing people kind of around the country to kind of local positions, mostly state and local positions. But in 1896, they really tried to throw their support behind a major national candidate in the form of this guy right here, William Jennings Bryan. And so what happened is William Jennings Bryan in the 1896 I'm sorry, let me back up. So 1896 Republican National Convention. The current president was a Republican. He's done 2 terms. He isn't planning to do another one. And so the Republicans, they easily nominate the kind of the establishment candidate, a guy named William McKinley, who is, I think, not a bad guy. He is going to be the very last Civil War veteran to be president. He fought for the Union. So, there's that. But that's the candidate. He's very much the establishment, pro big business, guy. Then the Democrats at their convention, they're kind of at a loss. It's not clear who's going to get nominated. It's important to note, primary elections had not been invented yet. So the way the parties picked their candidates was at their national convention. They figured it out there and voted on it there. Now, technically, they do still vote on it there today, right? But it's based on primaries. If there was primaries, because sometimes, you have special circumstances where there's not. But anyway, and so at the national convention, this guy, William Jennings Bryan, goes on stage and gives this rousing speech in which he says, the American worker and the American farmer have been crucified upon a cross of gold. And what he's talking about is he's saying that by holding America to the gold standard, that is, every dollar is worth X ounces of gold that is in the U.S. Treasury, we are limiting the ability for, it's really kind of complicated, and he's not completely wrong, but he's also not completely right. And you don't really need to understand it, to be totally honest. I'm going to tell you that. You really don't. Basically, I will explain it in very simple terms. Inflation, right? We know in 2024, we know inflation is not a good thing, right? But a little inflation could be a good thing for certain people, right? So imagine that you're someone who owes money to the bank that's part of how you run your business, which would be a farmer, right? Farmers always are owing money to the bank and then paying it back with interest, right? Now take interest out of the equation. Just say I owe $1,000 to the bank. If there's crazy inflation and, last year $1,000 could buy me a tractor, and this year $1,000 could buy me a tire for that tractor. If I owe $1,000 to the bank, I still only owe them $1,000, regardless of inflation. Now, if I'm selling crops, and last year my crops were selling for $1,000 a ton, and this year they're selling for $2,000 a ton because inflation, that $2,000, that doubling of that double inflation, that crazy amount of inflation is really bad for people buying my crops, but it's really good for me because I still only owe $1,000 to the bank. What I owe to the bank doesn't go up with inflation. So the People's Party, the Populist, and also William Jennings Bryan, they're arguing that a little controlled inflation could be really good for America's farmers. How so? By adding a second metal to what we base the the money off of. So now instead of a dollar being worth X ounces of gold, it could be worth X ounces of gold plus 20 ounces of silver or something like that. And so now basically the US government can buy up silver reserves to put in the bank and print dollars based on that silver. Sorry, my phone just went off. Let me put that on silent. Um, and so they're not calling for just like crazy runaway inflation. They're calling for injecting a little bit of inflation into the economy by injecting silver into what our money's based on. Now, of course, today our money is based on imagination, right? We don't base it on gold or silver or anything else. We're just like, oh, this is now there's more dollars. Here's some more dollars. And it's a little unfair. It's based on debt, but it's complicated and dumb now more so than it was then. But as I said, I told you this is a little boring, honestly. Anyway, the populace are like, hey, this Brian guy, he wants the thing we want, which, by the way, they call bimetallism, because two metals. So rather than nominate our own candidate for president, we're going to throw all our support behind William Jennings Bryan. And so in the election, Bryan's up against McKinley, and Bryan, the Democrats, all told, spend let me look at I wrote it down in my notes. How much did they spend? They spent uh 10 million. I'm sorry. Hold on. I want to say what else Bryan called for. He was a big fan of the social gospel we learned about in chapter 16, the idea that Christians have a moral obligation to help society. He wanted the government to help the poor, ordinary Americans with job programs and things like that. He was in favor of a progressive income tax, meaning that taxes would be at different rates based on how much money you have, which is what we have now, but there was no such thing as that yet. He wanted to regulate the banks, and he wanted to make unions protected under federal law. All things we have today, none of which we had back then, other than I guess the social gospel. And so anyway, meanwhile, Republicans are like, we don't want to go off the gold standard because the gold standard is really good for keeping inflation down. It makes sure that, banks aren't getting paid with worthless money, and we like the banks. So that's what we want to do. And so anyway, in this election, William Jennings Bryan and the Democratic Party spend $300,000 on his campaign. The Republicans spend $10 million on McKinley's campaign. And so they're just able to out ad buy them. And, across the country, newspapers are filled with ads like this one, where they suggest that adding silver to the money supply would make us like all these poor countries that we look down on, right? And so that's what's going on in this cartoon. And anyway, it goes about the way you should expect it to go when one party outspends the other party by such a massive amount. And so, yeah, McKinley is going to win 51% of the popular vote to Bryan's 47. McKinley's going to win 61% electoral college to Bryan's 39%. And there you are. All right. Now, I did skip over a really famous strike, the Pullman strike, and I did want to talk about that. I just felt like the populist to Bryan thing makes sense to talk about all at once. The Pullman strike is a really kind of... Actually, I'm going to skip over the Pullman strike just for time's sake, other than to say that the leader of the Pullman strike is a union leader named Eugene V. Debs, and he is going to come back up in chapter 18 as an important character in that chapter. So, but read about the Pullman strike on your own. I'm going to move on and talk about the South and segregation. First, by talking about the Redeemers. So if you took History 1301, you are aware, or maybe if you just remember from high school or 8th grade, probably actually, if you're a Texas public school student. After the Civil War, there's this period of time in the South, about 10 years, 10, 12 years, 10, 11, about 11 years total, called Reconstruction, where the federal government was attempting to reintegrate the southern states and integrate African Americans in the South into the United States in a way that would be good for them. And it did not work out. It was heavily resisted, of course, by racists in the South, but and by others. outside the South, in fact, and for a variety of reasons that aren't just racism, though racism is extremely important main reason. And one of these groups that was really instrumental in destroying Reconstruction in the 1870s was a group called the Redeemers. And the Redeemers were these Democratic politicians from the South who regained control of Southern politics by claiming they were going to redeem the South from the evils of Negro rule or Republican rule. And they argued very falsely that under Reconstruction, Republicans and blacks had basically ruined the South and destroyed it through corruption and ineptitude, which was just absolutely false, just not supported by any evidence whatsoever. And so the Redeemers came in and they won elections, and then they ended Reconstruction and set the South up for how it would be for the next, let's be nice and say 150 years. So, yeah. Anyway, and so what did they do? How did they go about redeeming? Well, it talks about it here. They cut state budgets, cut taxes, especially on land ownership, closed down public hospitals and asylums, cut funding for education, and especially cut funding for any kind of program which might in some way help a black person. They also passed laws that allowed this system in which blacks allowed a system of what were called, well, sorry, I got to back up and give a little bit of context. So the 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlaws slavery in the United States, except it doesn't. It says slavery is illegal unless as punishment for a crime. And so we allowed slavery to continue to exist, but only for convicts. And so under the Redeemers, the South started finding ways to put an inordinate amount of black men in prison in order to have essentially a government-owned slave labor system. And so these included vagrancy laws where any white person could arrest any black person, any black man that they saw outdoors without a job. So you're a black man, you're walking home from whatever, and white man stops you on the road and says, "Who do you work for?" And if you don't have an employer, if you're unemployed, then he's like, "Come with me, you're under arrest." And then he takes you to jail and you are tried for vagrancy, and the punishment for vagrancy is hard labor. That's an example. But there's other things, minor crimes that would not normally be punished with jail time, resulting in jail time with prison, hard labor. That's their new term for slave labor. And then these convict laborers could be rented out by the state government to local businesses, farms, plantations, right? Lumber companies, mines, railroads, etc. And so this is part of what the Redeemers are doing. Now, there is this one guy, Henry Grady. He's an Atlanta newspaper editor, owner, and he had this idea of revitalizing the South. Vitalizing the South. He called it the New South. And the idea was that the South should stop focusing on agriculture, or on cotton. The South should stop focusing on cotton and should diversify agriculture, start growing other crops, and also bring in industry and banking and trade and all that kind of stuff. And he thought this would be really good for the South. And it caught on, and the South did do this a little bit, but it didn't really work. And so why did it not work? Well, the South's main attraction to businesses is that they have very low wages and very low taxes. So a business moves into the South, right? For instance, the steel industry started pushing into Birmingham, Alabama. Yeah, Birmingham, Alabama became the Pittsburgh of the South for a little while. But the thing is, the reason steel companies want to operate in Birmingham is because the South, Alabama, has laws outlawing unions. It has no minimum wage law, so there's no minimum amount of money you can pay people. This is before there's federal minimum wage. And they know the police in Alabama are going to be very pro-business, anti-labor, especially anti-black labor. And there's no taxes on businesses, right? So say a steel company moves to Birmingham. Well, that creates a bunch of jobs in Birmingham, a bunch of very low paying jobs. And it doesn't really help taxes. It doesn't, help the city grow because the reason they moved to Birmingham is so they wouldn't have to pay business taxes, or so they pay very low property taxes. So it's not like it's building up the tax base and increasing funding for education and hospitals and things like that. So even though the New South does lure, and lure sounds negative, which I guess I'm being negative. But though it does, draw in a lot of business to the South, the business it draws in is not really good for the economy. That's kind of the issue. And so you can look at, the South, and you look at, today, right? If you look at per capita income, right, which is your by state. So you look at your state, per capita income is how much money total does the state bring in divided by the number of people in that state, right? Per capita is the best way to look at almost any statistic there is, because obviously Rhode Island is going to have way lower income than Texas. But per capita, Rhode Island blows us out of the water by a long shot, right? And makes sense, right? So if you look at the per capita income by state, the bottom 25 states, all but two of them are in the South. So, in fact, in the top 25, only Virginia is the only southern state in the top 25. Actually, they're number 29, so they're not in the top 25. They're close, though. They're the highest. Texas is number 30 the last time I looked at the list, which admittedly was like 10 years ago. So maybe Texas has gone up. Maybe we're 29 now. Anyway, but this is a legacy of these issues of the Redeemers. All right, so I'm going to move ahead, and I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff. I'm going to talk about the, let's see, do I have, let's see. So the book talks, let me double check that I'm on the right track. Let's talk about Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is an important figure in American history. He was at the time seen as a leader of the African American community, though today he is kind of regarded pretty negatively by the African American community in general. And you'll notice there's a lot of schools named after him in the South, and there's not many schools named after him in the North. And that has to do with what he argued, because he was seen as, by the United States at large, as the voice of African Americans, especially Southern African Americans, because he's from the South. He was the president of the Tuskegee Institute, which was a all-black technical college that later expanded to also teaching some. I mean, today it's actually a HBCU. HBCU, full 4-year university and all that in Alabama. But at first it was just a tech school where you could learn trades, primarily agriculture. They taught farming techniques and stuff, and then education, which back then to be a teacher did not require any kind of education whatsoever. You didn't have to have even a college degree to be a teacher, but there were some schools that taught education as like a trade school thing, and they were one of them. And he's seen as, an educator, right? I believe, in fact, he had a college degree in education from Atlanta University, which was an all-black university. But I might be mixing him up. Anyway, but he was the president of Tuskegee Institute, which was started by a group of northern white investors who wanted to help Southern blacks. One of those investors that started that company, in fact, the main investor, the one who spent the most money, was Andrew Carnegie. And I believe he handpicked Booker T. Washington. So at this point, you're like, well, this guy sounds pretty cool. I get why they named schools after him. Okay, so what I'll tell you is those schools named after him were mostly built during segregation. For instance, in Conroe, where I live and grew up, there is a alternative school that used to be a junior high called Washington High School. Washington High School, once upon a time, was Booker T. Washington Colored School. And it was the all-black high school when Conroe was segregated. And that brings me to what he said. He gave this speech in Atlanta which the African American civil rights leader, founder of the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois, called the Atlanta Compromise. And in this speech, he essentially tells blacks, stop worrying about the right to vote. Stop worrying about segregation. Who cares about segregation? Who cares if we're allowed to vote? What you need to focus on is getting a good trade school education and working really hard and saving up your money. And then, if you've shown the white community, once we, African Americans, have shown the white community that we're hard workers and valuable to the economy, then they will give us our rights. They'll give us the right to vote. There's a few issues with this. One, oppressors don't stop oppressing because you ask nicely. Two, didn't blacks show they were really essential to the economy for like 300 years? And no one in the South gave them their rights, that's for sure. So it is a very foolish point of view, honestly. It's interesting because people are like, Teddy Roosevelt, he was really great on race. He was the first person to invite an African American to dine at the White House. It's like, that's true. He invited Booker T. Washington specifically. He invited that guy. And not that Booker T. Washington's like a bad person or something, but he didn't invite W.E.B. Du Bois. He didn't invite any of the founders of the NAACP, any of the people who were out there protesting Birth of a Nation and things like that. He invited the guy who was most famous for telling blacks not to worry about civil rights. So now I think maybe it becomes a little more clear why Southern states love to name all black segregated schools after him. But anyway, but let's move off of him and let's talk about the elimination of black voting. So the 15th Amendment very clearly states the right to vote shall not be infringed on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That is, can't stop someone from voting based on their race, their skin color, which might not be the same thing, or whether or not they used to be a slave. So yeah, that was passed in 1867, kind of, after the Civil War. And anyway, so the southern states aren't allowed to do that anymore. But I mean, they're not going to just let black people vote, right? So they've got to come up with some alternatives. So one of them is a literacy test. So this one right here, this is a copy of the state of Louisiana's literacy test from 1964. By the way, this was all made illegal by the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Thank you, President Lyndon Johnson of Texas, the only president actually from Texas in U.S. history. It says, draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. Huh? Draw a line around. Well, first of all, a line around. Does that mean a circle? The number or letter of this sentence? Well, do they mean the one? Because that's a number. But the letter of the sentence? What are they asking? All right, number 2, draw a line under the last word in this line. That one seems all right. Just right there, right? Cross out the longest word in this line. Okay, all right. Draw a line around the shortest word in this line. Sorry, I got a little feedback. Forgot to turn off my speakers. Okay. Again, we've got this draw a line around because here it says to circle. So how do you draw a line around? Do you draw like a box? Because that's 4 lines. Circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line. So does that mean A? Does it mean the A in alphabet? Okay, in the space below, draw 3 circles, one inside, engulfed by the other. Wait, 3 circles, one inside the other. Which of the others? Okay. Above the letter X, make a small cross. Is that the same thing as an X? Or do we do it, because if I was Japanese, I would say an X is this, right? But if I'm American, is it this? And then does it matter where the crossbar is? Are we doing like a holy cross or like a plus sign, right? And anyway, hopefully you're starting to see what they're doing here. They're trying to make sure that uneducated people have no chance of actually being allowed to vote. And then you use segregation of education to make sure that blacks are uneducated. Now, problem with this is you'll catch some whites too, but it's not like they really want poor whites to vote that much anyway either, right? But there's ways to get around that. Sometimes the test is oral and they just ask you a trivia question. They ask you, what is the first word in the Lord's Prayer? And the white person who's asked that question goes, our? And they're like, yeah, you got it. Yay, you get to vote. And then the black person walks up and they say, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? And the black person's like, 10,000. They're like, oh, nope, it's 1,000,000. Sorry, you can't vote. And that kind of stuff. Or another one they used to do that's kind of famous is they would just have them read a passage out of the Bible. So the white person who can't read is shown a Bible and they put their finger on it and they say, here, read this one. John 3:16. Now, they're in a Jesus loving white person in the 1950s Louisiana who doesn't know John 3:16, even if they're illiterate. Black person walks up and they push a Bible in front of them that is written in Chinese and they say, here, read this one. The black person goes, I can't read that. That's not English. And he goes, you can't read that? It clearly says, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. I guess you can't read, can't vote. See ya. And so things like this are used to prevent blacks from voting. This is Pitchfork Ben Tillman, the governor and later senator of South Carolina, who worked tirelessly to disenfranchise black voters in his state, in spite of being a vocal and somewhat effective opponent of lynching, which is the murder of African Americans in his state, or in the United States. So anyway, it's yeah, I gotta say, if your political leader has a nickname like Pitchfork, not gonna be great on civil rights, but who could say, right? Shouldn't judge people by their names. All right, let's talk about Plessy versus Ferguson. So this is when you see these italics and it's name v period name. Those are Supreme Court cases. Technically, they're court cases, but I'm not going to make you remember any non-Supreme Court cases. You do need to know Supreme Court cases. If they're in your study guide, you need to know them. There's about 20 this semester total. This is our very first one. Plessy, no, it's not 20. It's more like 20 in both my classes combined. Maybe it's 10. Anyway, Plessy versus Ferguson. By the way, one last little grammar lesson for you. I was a English history double major, so I love grammar because I'm a nerd. So versus, if we're talking sports teams, Aggies versus, the Cougars or whatever, it's VS period. But if we're talking court cases, it's V period. So there you go. Learned that from my 12th grade AP government teacher in high school. All right, Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, so the deal with Plessy versus Ferguson is, first the background. Before Plessy versus Ferguson, a different case about 5 years earlier. So in the South, trains were one of the things that were segregated. Passenger trains were segregated. And the way passenger trains worked is you have you got your engine, your locomotive, right? And your coal car, which is like full of coal for the engine, right? And then you've got your white only passenger cars. And these, range from like kind of a first class, what's called a sleeper car, where you've got a bed and all that, to just, standard coach type seating. These are white only. They've got glass windows. They, on the newer trains, they might have electric lighting and fans, but by this point, they don't have that stuff. They've just got, gas lamps if it's, and things like that. And then behind that, you've got a dining car, right? And then behind the dining car, you have what's called the sin car, and that's a bar. That's a car that just serves alcohol. And then behind that, you've got what are called the colored cars. The colored cars are passenger cars for black people. These are typically just box cars with holes cut in the side for windows. No lighting, just a wooden bench in a box car with holes in the side for ventilation. Problem, if you've ever been, maybe you were a kid, you have to be old like me, probably, to have grown up with parents or grandparents who smoke in the car while driving. And they've got the window down, blowing smoke out the window, and you're in the back seat, and you're like hot. And so you decide to roll down your window. And you roll down your window, and all that cigarette smoke that's flying out of the driver's window sucks in and just blasts you in the face, right? That's what's happening to all that very carcinogenic black smoke, that coal smoke full of arsenic and other bad stuff. It's going down the side of the train, and when it gets to the color cars, it just goes in. And if you weren't black when you went inside, you're black when you come out, right? And so there was this case where this woman who was very light, she was African American, but she was very light skinned, to the point that she could pass for white. She's about 7 months pregnant, and she has to ride on a train. And so she gets on and pretends to be white, and she sits in the white only car passenger cars. Well, a neighbor recognizes her and tells the conductor, "Hey, that white woman's colored. She's not white. She's colored. She needs to go back in the color car." So they tell her she's got to go back. So she goes back. She gets in the color car, but all the smoke is coming in. She's pregnant. She doesn't like that. So she goes up to the sin car. Now, the sin car isn't segregated by race, right? Because they want everybody to drink so they make money. But it is segregated by gender because everywhere in the United States, pretty much back then, it was illegal for women to be in bars. Just was. And so she's thrown out and told to go back to the color car. So instead, she stands on the kind of outside of the sin car for the entire 6-hour train ride. Ends up having a miscarriage, loses the baby. So she sues and she wins. The state Supreme Court of Louisiana rules that the segregation of the train was illegal because it resulted in the death of the baby. They weren't worried about race. They weren't worried about her, but they were worried about that unborn child, if you can imagine that. So she wins. And this civil rights group says, you know what? That's not exactly what we're looking for, but that's a foot in the door, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to go after this law on purpose with a man, and a clearly like very dark-skinned black man named Homer Plessy. He's going to go and sit in the white only car and refuse to leave. And so he does, and he is arrested. They stop the train and he is arrested and taken off the train in handcuffs because he refused to go to the black only car. Does this sound familiar? He is Rosa Parks, but a man and 60 years earlier. And so they sue, and it goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they rule 8-1. They rule 8-1 against him. And in their ruling, the Supreme Court says segregation by race is completely legal so long as facilities are separate but equal. Now, were those facilities even remotely equal? No, but that doesn't actually matter. You just have to say they're separate but equal. So a good example of separate but equal is education. Here's a black-only school, and here is the white-only school in the exact same town. Black-only school, white-only school. Separate but equal, right? Anyway. So, and I will admit, these pictures are about 10 years apart, but still pretty accurate. So anyway, that is separate but equal. Well, Plessy versus Ferguson, establishing this doctrine of separate but equal, is hugely important because this creates the Jim Crow segregation system. Prior to Plessy versus Ferguson, segregation was common in the South, but it was not the law. Sometimes a city might have a segregation law, but typically there was not laws like forcing segregation. If I owned a restaurant in Conroe in 1890 and I wanted to let black people sit in my restaurant, well, my restaurant would probably end up getting burned by the KKK, but it's not illegal. But after Plessy versus Ferguson, every southern state makes segregation the law. Now the law does not say I can segregate, it says I have to segregate. And it becomes in every aspect of life. And the purpose of segregation has the same purpose as our next topic, lynching, which is to control the black population. Segregation is there to separate blacks and whites so that white people will feel as if they have nothing at all in common with blacks, so that white people will never stand up for blacks. Lynching has a similar purpose. It's to keep blacks afraid and in line, and to teach whites that blacks deserve all this. So lynching is technically the murder by a group of people of a person as punishment for an alleged crime. Now, the difference is the crime was almost never, ever actually true. Almost never rarely did the crime even happen in the first place. Usually the crime was made up. When the crime did happen, the person who was arrested for it was almost always a convenient scapegoat and not someone who was actually involved. But it's important to understand this is not you're arrested by the police, you go and you have a trial, you're found guilty, you're sentenced to death. This is you're arrested or not even arrested, and then a group of angry townspeople grab you and take you out and kill you, usually by hanging. But sometimes it was even more organized than that. For instance, in this picture, 10,000 people showed up to Paris, Texas to watch the lynching of Henry Smith, who was accused of raping and murdering a 4-year-old girl. Now, did he do it? There's no evidence that he did. Was the girl killed? Yes. Was she raped? I don't think there was any evidence of that either. But sexual crime against a white girl or woman is almost always part of the alleged crime against black men. And this is because there was a big fear, let's say, a fear among a lot of Southern white men that white women would start having sex with black men. And this was just something they were really concerned about for whatever reason. So this would be a punishment for interracial relationships, which, remember, interracial marriage did not become legal in Texas until the Supreme Court forced us in 1969, the year my mom graduated high school. Anyway, so I was curious. I looked it up. It says 10,000 people showed up to watch this lynching. In 1893, the population of Paris, Texas was around 8,000 or 8,500 actually. So this is probably literally every person in town plus people from the surrounding area. Paris is the seat of its own county, so that, But anyway, there's only 24,000 people in Paris, Texas now. But anyway, similar sized crowd went to in 1906. There's a lynching in Waco. Similar, a woman, a wealthy white woman, a widow, was found murdered by gunshot, and her handyman, who was black, was arrested, and he was held in the jail without being formally charged. Meanwhile, the city declared a city holiday so that the kids would be out of school. The high school marching band performed for the crowds. 10,000 people showed up. Professional photography studio from Dallas was brought in to provide portraits so people could get commemorative photos with the dead body. He was then hanged, then set on fire. Then after the fire went out, people got their celebratory photos with his charred corpse. And then it was tied to the back of a truck, which then dragged his remains through the city until they basically disintegrated. And then local general store gave kids a free piece of candy for the next week if they could bring in a piece of his body. So yeah, that's lynching, and it was extremely widespread. These are estimates of how many lynchings were done by state over about a 20-year period or 30-year period. You can see Texas, we were number 3 with about 335 over a 30-year period. So that's about around 10 per year that are confirmed. There's probably more, but these are the ones where they could actually confirm this definitely happened. And I say they, the person most responsible for this was an African-American woman, a journalist, former nurse named Ida B. Wells. Yeah, Ida B. Wells. IDA. So anyway, she is an important figure for doing this. All right, the next item I want to talk about, I'm going to, they did have one more thing. This was also discussed in chapter 15, was called the Lost Cause narrative. This is something that really got big in the Gilded Age in the South. And this was this mythos that kind of spread up around the Civil War and especially the antebellum South, the pre-Civil War South. And this myth, the myths, this is like a body of myth, and it's absolute myth. It is absolute BS, hogwash, made up fiction that my mom was taught in high school as fact by her history teachers. And it is absolutely fictional. The Lost Cause included the idea that, most slaves were actually treated pretty well by their masters. Most slaves were happy being slaves and didn't want to be free. No, we have very clear documented evidence. The majority of slaves were beaten, tortured. The majority of female slaves were raped by their owners. Majority, more than 50%. Very few slaves were treated well. Very, very few slaves were happy being slaves. That is just absolute BS. And it should seem like absolute BS to us in 2024, yet maybe it doesn't to all people. But anyway, but also there's more to it, right? This is when you start to hear this idea that, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, which is true. It was about states' rights to have slavery. It was also about economics, the economics of slavery. It was about federal control getting in the way of states being able to run their own slavery. It was about political rivalries between the pro-slavery Democrats and the anti-slavery Republicans. There were other issues as well, like racial issues around slavery and cultural issues around the culture of slavery. And hopefully I've made my point. And also, this is also when we start to see the building of statues. So people often bring up like, oh, these statues, they're history. They're the history of the Civil War. I dare you to find any statue of any Confederate leader that was made before the Gilded Age, that was made, during the Confederacy. Because if there were actual statues built during the Confederacy, those would be historical landmarks of Confederacy. Now, I would still say, who cares? Because we didn't let the Germans keep a bunch of statues of Hitler all over Germany. So, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, all these statues that people have strong feelings about, which is fine if you do, they were mostly built in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, or a little earlier, maybe the 1890s, right? So, for instance, the ones at the at the Texas State Capitol in Austin, that one, for instance, right? If you've ever been to our state capitol building in Austin, beautiful, beautiful red or pink granite building. It's gorgeous, great architecture. It was built in the 1880s, 1890s. And if you go there, there's this big kind of obelisk. It's a monument to the people that fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. It was built in 1903. So it's not a monument from the Confederacy. It's a monument glorifying the Confederacy from the period of Jim Crow. And it's on purpose because this was a big part of trying to maintain this racial system in the South, was convincing people that the Civil War was not about maintaining slavery and that the people that fought in the Civil War were on the right side of history. And that's why all these statues exist. Now, if you're on the side of yes, but it's still history and we shouldn't tear it down, that's completely fine. You should just know what history it is. That Civil War Memorial in Austin is a memorial to Jim Crow segregation. Or it's a memorial from Jim Crow segregation, glorifying something from the Confederacy, or paying tribute to, right? Anyway, this is also when we get the phrase, the South shall rise again. This was the second half of a longer phrase, just as Christ rose from the cross, so too the South shall rise again. That's a big part of the lost cause, is comparing Jesus to the Confederacy, or to Confederate leaders like Robert E. Lee, as seen here. This is also when the myth that Robert E. Lee didn't own slaves, that's where that comes from. That's not true at all. He very much owned a lot of slaves, actually, and was kind of infamous for being a especially brutal slave owner, in fact. But moving off of that, let's talk about immigrants. Because, one thing that has never happened in American history is that there's a bunch of immigrants and then a bunch of people get super racist about it. So this is actually I'm again being facetious. I apologize. This is a trend we see in American history. There will be these periods of history where we have a big, big boost in immigration. And that big, big boost in immigration is always accompanied by a big boost in what we call nativism, which is anti-immigrant sentiment, right? Anti-immigrant feelings. And so, in the 1850s, there's this big wave of immigration from Ireland and Germany. And there's this big wave of nativism against those immigrants, especially the Irish immigrants, because the Irish immigrants tended to be poor working class, whereas the German immigrants tended to be middle class. Similarly, in the 1890s, in the Gilded Age, we have the biggest by percentage wave of immigration in all of American history. These immigrants, these so-called new immigrants, which we'll learn more about in chapter 18, are mostly from southern and central Europe. I'm sorry, Eastern and Southern Europe, um, and uh, and they are mostly illiterate, or at least don't speak English. They mostly are working class, poor, and they are going to be despised. It is going to be seen, as you see in this cartoon, a wave of riffraff immigration, and Uncle Sam is doing everything he can to protect liberty from it, from this danger to American ideas and institutions. Like, the idea of us being a land of immigrants, home, home of the free, etc. But anyway, yeah, there's going to be a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment going on, and kind of the most egregious or extreme example of this is the Chinese Exclusion Act, which your book actually does not use that term. Your book refers to it as an act excluding Chinese immigrants. It was literally called the Chinese Exclusion Act. So what happened is California was getting a lot of immigrants from China. Now, relatively speaking, of all immigration in the Gilded Age, Chinese immigrants made up less than 3%. But those 3% were almost all coming to California, or, well, to the West Coast. I mean, this guy's in Idaho, for instance. And there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment and violence going on the West Coast. California tried to just ban Chinese immigrants. Thing about it is, it's not constitutional for any state to ban immigrants from their state. It's very clearly stated in Article 4 of the Constitution that no state can prohibit the free movement between their state and other states. So, while a state can absolutely try to secure its border from people coming across from another country, if those people come across to a different state and then come to your state, there's nothing you're allowed to do about that. And if the federal government says they can come to your state, there's nothing that your state can do about that. But while this law is struck down, Congress says, okay, we'll do it then. And in I want to say 1888, yeah, in 1888, they banned Chinese immigration to the United States for 10 years. 1898 rolls around and they say, you know what, let's run it up again. And they do another 10 years. Another 10 years. Let me double check actually what the date is. Not that I think it super matters what the exact date is. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's 1882. So 1882, 10-year ban. 1892, another 10-year ban. 1902, Congress says actually just permanently. No immigration from China forever. Now, this is eventually repealed 30 years later because in the 1930s, Japan is committing genocide against people in China, ultimately killing over 4 million Chinese civilians. So we start allowing Chinese immigrants again, during that genocide. But yeah. Anyway, yeah, so that's the Chinese Exclusion Act. Pretty tough stuff. All right. So anyway, moving on. I'm going to go ahead and actually skip on ahead now to the main topic of the chapter, though I do want to just point out the women's era, women getting rid of the booze. But let's move on and let's talk about our last topic of the chapter, American expansionism, aka American imperialism. So this is not simply a matter of, well, we're the good guys, so we call it expansionism, not imperialism. Most of what we do qualifies as expansionism, not imperialism. And I'll explain why. Imperialism is your nation actually literally taking land somewhere in the world and making it part of your country. That's imperialism. Expansionism is going to those places and just taking control of them unofficially by, overthrowing their governments and putting in place puppet governments that are friendly to you and controlling their economies and things of that nature. Most of what we do is more expansionism than imperialism, but we definitely do both. And kind of the first big example of it that we normally point out, it's really the first one I'm aware of, is Hawaii, right? So Hawaii, depicted here in this cartoon, was a island, a matrilineal monarchy led by a queen, Leo'okalani. Though I recently heard like a podcast where they were talking about her father being in charge, but I'm pretty certain she was the one in charge at the end. But so maybe it's not completely matrilineal, is my point. Uh, anyway, but Americans had started colonizing Hawaii back in the 1870s. And by the 1890s, by 1895, the date we're looking at, Hawaii was a nation where almost all of the land was owned by a handful of very wealthy Americans, the main one being Sanford Dole, as in the fruit company, Dole. And the land on these plantations, basically, was very low paid Hawaiian native labor, native Hawaiian labor. They were paid very poorly, treated badly, worked very long hours, brutal conditions, growing pineapple, sugar, coffee for American agricorps like Dole. And the Queen made a mistake that we're going to see leaders of small countries make a few times this semester, and it's not ever going to work out well for them. And that is, she said, maybe we should nationalize X. In this case, X meaning being land. Maybe we should nationalize land, meaning maybe we should pass a law that only Hawaiians are allowed to own land in Hawaii. So Sanford Dole contacts the United States, says, "Can you take care of this?" And President McKinley, the newly uh, inaugurated President McKinley, so this is the next year. This is 2 years later, 1890s. So I was wrong. It's not 1895. It's 1897. Sorry, it says it right there on the slide. 1897. President McKinley sends in the Marines. They overthrow Leo'akalani's government, and at gunpoint, she signs a treaty turning Hawaii over to the United States, and Hawaii becomes a U.S. territory, not getting statehood for another almost 60 years. But anyway, that's how Hawaii became part of the United States. And yeah, still today, native Hawaiian people make up the majority of Hawaii's impoverished people, working class people, and homeless people. Anyway, so American expansionism kind of has three goals. There's three motivations going on behind American expansionism. There's a political motivation, right? The government wants to have political influence or even control, in the case of Hawaii, over areas of the globe in order, as part of our desire to enter the national stage and become a great world power. There's the cultural side of things, which is you have members of the social gospel, like not like William Jennings Bryan, actually, but people who, so I guess maybe social gospel is not a good example, actually, because social gospel people are actually pretty against it, usually. Religious people, though, there is a religious motivation to spread American Christianity to places that don't have it. So there's that. But by far, the main motivation is American businesses are looking for access to cheap raw materials and access to markets to sell their manufactured goods. And so that's really the main motivation. And remember, in the Gilded Age, or always, American business and American corporations, big business, and the U.S. government are hand in hand and one and the same. Now, this brings us to the most momentous event of America's expansionist period, and that is the Spanish-American War. I'm skipping over a bunch of stuff here. Basically, let me get to a map. All right, Cuba. Cuba and Puerto Rico were the last two Spanish colonies in the New World. How far Spain has fallen, right? They were the first, right? Cristoforo Colombo, his actual name, from Genoa in modern day Italy, was working for Spain for Ferdinand Isabella when in 1492 he sailed the ocean blue and bumped into the Bahamas and thought he was in Japan and called the people Indians because that's what they thought everybody's Indian if you're in Asia back then. It's a whole thing. So Spain, right? They were the first ones. They were the ones that began this whole colonizing the New World stuff. And now, by the 20th century or the dawn of the 20th century, all they have left is Cuba and Puerto Rico. They've lost everything else, right? And in Cuba, there is this revolutionary movement to overthrow the Spanish. led by a guy named Jose Marti. Jose Marti had been kicked out of Cuba by the Spanish. He was living in exile in the United States. And there are these wealthy imperialist guys, including Teddy Roosevelt, who would throw these fancy parties, and they would sip their cognac and smoke their cigars, and they would invite Jose Marti, and they would lift their glasses and say, Cuba Libre, Cuba Libre. Someday, Jose, someday we're going to help you get Cuba back for the Cuban people. When in reality, what they mean is someday we're going to help you set up a puppet government in Cuba that will serve our business interests. Well, that someday comes about in 1897. Jose Marti is sent back to Cuba with American guns bought with American money, and he starts a revolution. And, which is a good thing. Spain is a horrible, imperialist government. Spain responds by inventing something called the concentration camp. And things get real rough in Cuba. They're getting really bad. In America, the news of what's going on in Cuba is, while it is very bad, it is exaggerated very much by what we call the yellow press, which is this, just exaggerated news stories that focused on violence and sex and scandal and so on. And they're really exaggerating what's actually happening in Cuba. Well, one thing leads to another, and President McKinley sends the USS Maine, America's most technologically advanced, newest battleship, to Havana Harbor, to Havana, Cuba, just as a kind of a show of force that, hey, there's a lot of Americans living in Havana. You better make sure that none of them get hurt in this little dust up you guys are having. Now, there are a lot of people pushing for McKinley to actually attack and take Cuba, free Cuba. He resisted. He said, I will not send American boys to die in these Cuban boys' war. Very, very similar to what Lyndon Johnson famously said about Vietnam. I'll not send American boys to go die in a war that should be fought by Vietnamese boys. Very similar. And like Johnson, after him, McKinley's a veteran, right? Johnson's a World War II veteran. McKinley is a Civil War veteran. He served at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in all of Civil War history. The Battle of Antietam. He served there. He said, I remember young boys stacked like cords of wood at Antietam. I will not see more young boys die in Cuba for an unworthy cause. That's what he said. But he still sends the USS Maine. And what do you know? The USS Maine blows up mysteriously that night in Havana Harbor. Now, people like the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, they're calling for immediate war. McKinley's like, no, we're not going to go to war yet. But eventually he relents, and we declare war on Spain. And so, of course, the first thing we do is destroy the Spanish fleet at the Philippines on the opposite side of the planet from Cuba. Because that is our actual reason for this war. We want a foothold in the Pacific right next to China so we can start getting in on the China trade more. That's really what this is all about. But also Cuba would be nice because that's kind of a major country right there in the middle of our neck of the woods, right there in the middle of America's bathtub, as they sometimes call it, the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the Philippines, pretty easy nut to crack, kind of. We destroy the entire Spanish Pacific Fleet in one battle, and only one American dies, and he dies from getting overheated and has a heat stroke, because we drastically outclass Spain when it comes to technology. But militarily, Spain has got way more guys. We have very few guys to fight in the Philippines. They've got over 30,000 just in the Philippines. So we team up with this guy right here, Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of a anti-Spanish Philippine resistance movement, and we help him to overthrow Spain in the Philippines. More on that in a little bit. Meanwhile, in Cuba, we've got to build a volunteer army. And so we start calling for volunteers to build a temporary volunteer army. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy, former police commissioner of New York City, and future U.S. President Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, TR as he liked to be called. He actually didn't go by Teddy. That was a name that other people made up for him. He liked to go by TR. Teddy Roosevelt, he quits his job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which was, by the way, not a military position, civilian government position, and joins the Army. He joins the volunteer army, and because he's rich, they're like, you'll be a colonel. So he becomes Colonel Roosevelt, third in command of the 5th Volunteer Cavalry, which he renames the Rough Riders, or often referred to by him and others as Teddy's Rough Riders. I love this painting. This is a really famous painting. This painting is, in fact, in the White House, usually. The paintings in the White House, they cycle them out. Every president's like, I'm going to take these paintings and put them back in, National Archives and get these other paintings I like. This one is usually in, there's a room in the White House called the Roosevelt Room because it has a portrait of Teddy Roosevelt in it. But I think this painting is also usually there. I'm not 100% sure. Fun thing I always like to point out about this painting. You notice how all the soldiers are wearing these black shirts. They're actually navy blue. There's very dark navy blue. They're wearing these dark navy blue shirts and tan pants, right? And then Teddy Roosevelt up here in the foreground is wearing this all tan outfit. So this outfit, the dark tan pants with the dark blue shirt, this was the official uniform of the 5th Regiment, well, of the Volunteer Army, of the U.S. Volunteer Army. Teddy Roosevelt was like, no, I'm not going to wear the regulation uniform. He went to Brooks Brothers in New York and had them create a uniform based on sketches that he made. He also had a pearl-handled revolver and a silver knife that he had made by Tiffany Jewelers. He also had, he liked to wear, he wore glasses, but he did not like them to go around his ears. He liked what are called pince-nez glasses, which are the ones that just sit on your nose. So he had 16 pairs of those, also made by Tiffany Company, silver ones. Because, he knew that they would be falling off and breaking, which a bunch of them did. So I just like to point out, Teddy Roosevelt, people like to talk about how tough he is. He's a fancy lad. He likes his fancy stuff. Anyway, he ends up taking command of the 5th Volunteer Regiment. His top commanding officer is a elderly guy that served in the Confederate Army in the Civil War and is suffering from dementia and thinks that they're fighting the Yankees. So he's pretty much brought to the back and told to just, sit here, General. We've got this. And the second command is so morbidly obese that he can barely walk. And he gets shot in the first battle. And so Roosevelt's in charge now. And he is supposed to take the cavalry regiment, which are on horseback, and guard the bottom of San Juan Hill to prevent the Spanish from retreating down San Juan Hill. But he doesn't want to do that because, that's not how you gain glory, right? You don't gain glory by guarding things. You gain glory by charging. And so he charges his men up the hill. Well, they get to a fence and they don't have the tools to cut the fence. So he makes all of his men get off their horses and run up the hill instead. And so they run up the hill, and about half of his men are killed because of this extremely foolhardy maneuver. He ends up getting pinned down. Famously, he talks about in his journal, or not journal. He wrote an autobiography. All right, he wrote a book, a history book, still used in classes. I've read a bit of it actually in grad school, called "The History of the Spanish War." But a friend of his said you should have called it "Alone in Cuba," because when you read it, he makes it sound like he won the war by himself. And anyway, in it, he says, I saw a young man cowering on the ground next to me. I said, this is when he was still on horseback. He's like, are you afraid to stand and fight when I'm up here on horseback and an easy target? The man stood up and was immediately killed. And he talks about that as if, yeah, this is awesome, isn't it? War. Love war. Because Teddy Roosevelt that's Teddy Roosevelt. Anyway, they make it almost up the hill. He and his men end up getting pinned down when they're rescued by an all-black regiment of the U.S. Army. He then takes command of the all-black regiment, and together, that all-black regiment and his remaining men, after he's gotten half of them killed, make it to the top of San Juan Hill and take the hill, and he becomes known as the hero of San Juan Hill. He then starts campaigning to get the Congressional Medal of Honor. He does not get it until after his death, making him still the only president in U.S. history to win the Congressional Medal of Honor and the only president to win, the only person ever to win both the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Nobel Peace Prize. which I would argue he also did not deserve, but, well, maybe he did. I don't know. Good question. Anyway, we'll learn more about Roosevelt in chapter 18. So the Spanish-American War is over. When it's all said and done, the U.S. gets the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Guam as permanent U.S. territories. And you're like, wait, no. The Philippines is an independent country. It is now. We'll learn more about that in chapter 22. Anyway, 22. So number one, we get the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. Number two, Cuba gets to be its own free country. And number three, we pay Spain $20 million as kind of a, hey, sorry, we destroyed your empire and took your stuff money. Or not. Anyway, now that brings us to the Philippines. How are things going to happen in the Philippines? Well, remember we told Emilio Aguinaldo, when this is over, the Philippines is going to be a free country. And then we're like, psych, y'all are part of the United States now. So Aguinaldo turns the Philippine rebels against the U.S., and there's a war, lasts several years. We ultimately win it by committing genocide and killing roughly 400,000 people, most of them civilians. And that convinces Aguinaldo to surrender. And then the Philippines is a U.S. territory till Japan takes it in World War II. And then after World War II, we take it back and we then set it free. So that's the Philippines. Anyway, there is Governor General of the Philippines, future U.S. President, and future Supreme Court Chief Justice, William Howard Taft. And there's some Filipino villagers brought as sort of like a zoo exhibit for the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. And anyway, Cuba, I didn't really talk about, well, what happened with Cuba? Cuba does get to be its own free country, asterisk. I don't know how to make an asterisk symbol. Asterisk. Ooh, that's pretty close. Asterisk. Asterisk. Read the fine print. So yes, Cuba does get to be its own free country. The United States helps them write their constitution, and we put in their constitution something called the Platt Amendment, which says that, one, they can never borrow money from anyone but the United States or U.S. banks. And number two, they have to give the U.S. a permanent lease on some land on the eastern tip of their island at a place called Guantanamo Bay for us to build a naval base. And three, the U.S. government can intervene in their country anytime we want, forever. So yeah, if you ever wonder, man, why is it we don't get along with Cuba these days? Well, anyway, we'll learn about more of that in a later chapter. But that is actually where I'm going to end it. So this was a fast one, a lot shorter than last video. Hope you enjoyed. Obviously, I did skip over some stuff in the study guide. Remember, use that study guide. And if you see anything in the study guide that I did not cover, you need to pay special attention to that on yourself. Okay. Just looking at the potential essay questions in the study guide real quick. The first one is discuss the challenges and progressive efforts to face those challenges for each of the following groups: African Americans and Chinese Americans. So we talked about both of those a bit. You need to look into them a little bit more. Number 5 is explain the causes, events, and results of the Spanish-American War. We covered that one pretty thoroughly, I think. And that's actually all the potential essay questions for chapter 17. So there you go. All right, and that is all. Have a pleasant rest of your week, and goodbye.